Welcome everybody. Hi, thanks for coming. So this is a panel discussion on Black politics and state violence. This is the SVA's Black Student Union in conjunction with the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm one of the presidents of the Black Student Union, and Allison is a part of Platypus. And I guess what the Black Student Union tries to do is be a kind of an organization that serves the Black students at SVA, trying to cultivate solidarity, build a network that lasts beyond the school, to have this kind of support system and also a kind of secondary or supplementary education. We have outings to specific kinds of galleries or movies and talks such as this, and we talk and have meetings and yeah, just kind of a whole network like that. And then Allison can speak on the Platypus, but we're the Black Student Union and we're co-hosting, and Allison can start with the Platypus.
I'd like to thank Tiffany and the Black Student Union for helping to facilitate this talk today. My name is Allison Hewitt-Ward, and I'm a member of the SVA chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Platypus was established in Chicago in December 2006 and hosts reading groups, public fora, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, and post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We are an international organization with chapters in Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, Toronto, London, and Berlin, to name a few. Iterations of today's panel will also be hosted by chapters in Chicago and Knoxville. On November 24th of last year, a grand jury in Ferguson, Missouri failed to indict Officer Darren Wilson for the August 9th shooting of Mike Brown. On December 3rd, a Staten Island grand jury failed to indict Officer Daniel Pantaleo for the killing of Eric Garner. The decisions ignited outrage and spurred protests across the country, loosely grouped around the hashtag Black Lives Matter. These events have positioned the questions of Black politics and state violence among the most pressing challenges facing the American left today. We have convened this panel for a critical evaluation of the historical and present positions of the left on these questions. So each of the panelists will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions with the first questions from the BSU, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the group. Just to introduce the panelists. Ben Bloomberg is a founding member of Platypus and has held many positions within the organization, including reading group leader, chapter head, and an elected member of its leadership body. He attended a master's in social sciences program at the University of Chicago, where his studies focused on the connections between race and class in the American context. He is currently out of school and works as an art handler for a gallery in Chelsea. Eljeer Hawkins is a writer on race, criminal justice, and the historic Black freedom movement. Eljeer is a community and anti-war activist born and raised in Harlem, New York. Eljeer is a member of Socialist Alternative /CWI for 20 years. Eljeer is a former shop steward with the Teamsters Local 851 and former member of SEIU 1199, currently is a non-union healthcare worker in New York City. He contributes regularly to Socialist Alternative and socialistworld.net. Dred Scott is an interdisciplinary artist whose work is exhibited across the U.S. and internationally. For 3 decades, he has made work that encourages viewers to re-examine cohering norms of American society. In 1989, the entire U.S. Senate denounced and outlawed one of his artworks, and President Bush declared it disgraceful because of its use of the American flag. His art has been exhibited, performed at MoMA PS1, Pori Art Museum in Finland, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and galleries and street corners across the country. He is a recipient of grants from Creative Capital Foundation and the Pollock Krasner Foundation, and his work is included in the collection of the Whitney Museum. So we'll start with them.
Thank you. First off, let me begin by thanking the Black Student Union of SVA and Platypus at SVA for hosting this talk today. which, as everyone I'm sure in this room knows, is an incredibly relevant issue to be addressed in our present times. Perhaps appropriately, as I'm, I think, the youngest person on the panel and therefore closest to the womb, I'd like to begin my remarks today by reading a Facebook post written by my mother. My mother lives in a low-income, racially and ethnically mixed neighborhood of St. Louis, not far from where the Ferguson events transpired. For the past 10 years, she's worked, since divorcing my father, she's worked in the kitchens of that city, often in a managerial position, which does come with greater responsibility, but few additional benefits, very little pay increase for her position, and really no job security, as has been proven recently, because she's just recently lost 2 jobs and is currently out of work. She grew up in the north, but as an adolescent she moved with her family to the south, and she bounced between several southern towns before eventually relocating to the northeast, where I was born and raised. While she's had the benefit of higher levels of education, and for a period of her life, her and my father enjoyed relative economic prosperity, a period which has pretty much ended for both of them, most of her life has been spent as a low-level wage earner, working in kitchens. She wrote the following thoughts after she watched the Stefan Sheriff 1965 documentary Montgomery March on the anniversary of the Bloody Sunday crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And this is quoting my mother. "Wow, so powerful. It is what I grew up watching on the news. I was 7 in 1965. And these scenes profoundly shaped my belief systems, philosophy, and social perspective, even my personality. 10 years later, I was living in Alabama and witnessed so much of what was still there. Gas stations still had 3 bathrooms, men, women, and a crossed out and locked because of a new law change, colored, which was a remnant of culture's lingering milieu. The society was so segregated. You were either with us or with them, whoever us and them were. And here I was, transplanted from Ohio into the 10th grade, and on my first day asked what my religion was, and my tray moved to a vacant table. I was stunned, disparaged, baffled. But my personal experiences aside, this film, with its persistent pounding of feet on pavement, powerfully illuminates the will of the people involved to press on over miles and miles, struggles over struggles, exhaustion beyond exhaustion to reach their goal. It's so inspiring. It makes me so sad to see the gun violence, the drug violence, the culture of disrespect so rampant in the city I live in. The white police against black teenagers, the drug dealers ambushing the police, the slogan Black Lives Matter, but 90% of murders in my city are committed by blacks against blacks. Then blacks against Bosnians, and the Vietnamese hate the Chinese, the Muslims against the blacks with their hate attitudes, and don't forget the Latinos. Yes, all these people live on my block. How can we cross that bridge between people? How can I create a bridge between my neighbors? I wish for a movement, a new movement in this country, where we can all find hope, respect, and a collective desire, a grassroots desire to improve the lot, not only of ourselves, but of our neighbors, no matter what the race, religion, or ethnicity. Can we work together to cross our own personal bridges?" That's the end of my mom's Facebook post. I know that I was invited to speak on this panel because I've studied and written about the history of the left's attempts to confront racism, especially in the early decades of the 20th century. And for those of you who are not in Platypus, you probably are not familiar with my writings. But nevertheless, I wrote an article called An Unmet Challenge, which reviewed this kind of deep history of the civil rights movement, especially in terms of Marxist and communist contributions, and also, most importantly, their failings to address the quote-unquote black problem in this country. And so, although I'm sure that Eljeer and I, for instance, could be able to debate the correctness of a resolution adopted by the Fourth International in the late 30s regarding the question of self-determination for African Americans, I believe that beginning with these historical debates simply skirts the real issue we face on the left today: how to reestablish the relevance of the left's history for present-day struggles and the future possibility of emancipatory politics. A solution to this question is hardly clear. It is to be expected that many in the Black Lives Matter movement, as was true of the Occupy movement before them, do not feel too concerned with whether they are on the left. Their problems are immediate, they are threatening, and the left, especially as it is constituted today, has very little to offer except an additional busload or two of clamorous and at times unwelcome voices at the protests and rallies, which they, the left, has not organized. So with this question in mind, I found myself scanning Facebook for the sentiments of my extended quote-unquote social network on the anti-racist activism of the present moment. Unsurprisingly, I found countless devastating articles detailing the abuses of police and the expressions of anger and rebellion these violations inspire in my Facebook comrades. Also, perhaps unsurprisingly, I found many expressions of reverence for the courage and determination of the civil rights movement, especially among my, and here I think civil rights movement, I'm kind of referencing the more liberal wing of it. And this was especially true amongst my less radical friends and my family, who have been inspired by the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. Obviously, this is in some part inspired by the film about that time. In addition to my mom, I also found my uncle got a tattoo across his. I mean, he's been doing some sort of weird body sculpting recently, but he got a tattoo of a silhouette of the people crossing the bridge in Selma on his abdomen. So obviously, this moment, this 50th anniversary of this kind of high water mark of the 60s and the civil rights movement has had an effect on some people close to me. But amongst all these posts, my mother's post stood out and stuck with me. At first, it was because her sentiments made me feel uncomfortable. Is there not something essentialist about her list of ethnic and racial groups, and problematic about the way she just throws out an unsubstantiated figure to pin black deaths on black perpetrators? But her post stuck with me, and it helped me organize my thoughts for this panel because it also highlighted an absence and a felt need for something possible but not existing in the present. According to my mother's autobiography, the great protest movements of the first half of the civil rights movement profoundly shaped her later beliefs through the experiences of her childhood and early youth. However, today, as an older woman, she feels detached from any movement and despairing at the lack of possibility for change. For me, what this highlighted was the way that the civil rights movement, and all its contradictions, because I think that it's problematic to describe the civil rights movement as one monolithic movement. I think that it was full of debate, and something I'll highlight in a minute. But the civil rights movement was really the last time there was a push for deeply penetrating change experienced in the United States. And its collapse into frustrated militancy, cynical despair, and ultimately a kind of accommodationist defeat defined the generational experience that connects the 1960s to the present. In other words, my mother, like most working class people today, have little to no political experience of social change and transformation in their adult lifetimes. In this vacuum, the longing for emancipation gets admixed with the accommodation to the world as given. In surprising ways, the thoughts of my mother's post provoked in me. In many surprising ways, the thoughts my mother's post provoked in me resonated with a famous speech given by Stokely Carmichael at UC Berkeley in 1966, which I had admittedly been listening to while meandering around on Facebook in order to multitask in preparation for the event. I found myself listening to this speech because if 2015 is being recognized as the anniversary of many significant civil rights events, such as the Montgomery March, other events of the same year, such as the founding of the Loudoun's County Freedom Organization, have largely been overshadowed. Under the leadership of Stokely Carmichael, this organization adopted the symbol of a Black Panther, foreshadowing the founding of the Black Panther Party the following year and the future direction of the movement in the latter half of the decade. From this experience of organizing voters in this county, Carmichael developed the slogan of Black Power, which he had actually picked up from Adam Clayton Powell, which Harold Cruz describes as a kind of transition from this slogan being used by the radical element of the bourgeois black activist to the lower middle class activists of the movement. So Carmichael developed the slogan of Black Power, which he first introduced and elaborated publicly in the Berkeley speech. In the background of my reading, Carmichael, with great oratorical skill, laid out the political issues that in his view were faced by the anti-racist movement of his day. Unsurprisingly, Carmichael's analysis overlapped with the current wave of anti-racist agitation we see online and in the Black Lives Matter movement in many significant ways. Among them is a stress placed on the idea of institutional racism. In Carmichael's speech, institutional racism was used to expose the limits of the civil rights movement and the legislature, which promised to allow blacks and whites to attend the same schools, sit at the same counters, etc. And he intended to use this notion of institutional racism to show that a deeper revolutionary change was necessary if the deeper structures that kept, legally 94% of children in poor segregated schools, even as the National Guard was on hand to enforce the legal entry of 6% of black students into formally segregated classrooms. In the contemporary movement, the concept of institutional racism is a tool for addressing the continuation, in often unconscious or unintended ways, of racial inequality, injustice, and persecution after the end of Jim Crow and the overtly racist politics of the pre-civil rights era. It is impossible to escape the fact that even in my mother's well-meaning post, something of this notion of institutional racism is expressed. The fact that a racialized schism exists even in the diverse neighborhood in which she lives, despite there being a strong basis for working class solidarity among its residents. The fact that my mother's views of her world, even of her neighbors, is seen through this fractured lens and racialized lens. And also the fact that my mother, here and perhaps elsewhere in conversation with her, sympathizes with the police while acknowledging their abuses. And this today would, I think, be described by anti-racist activists as evidence of her being an expression of institutional racism, her opinions at least. However, the fact that our present and Carmichael's past share a focus on institutional racism does not only serve to bridge the past and present, but also to reveal the great distance that separates them. Likewise, the reason my mother's comments resonated in my mind with Carmichael's speech for me isn't because he would have had the same criticism of her as one would expect somebody today to give. Rather, in his speech, Carmichael brilliantly turned the notion of the black problem, quote unquote, on its head. There was no such thing as a black problem, he argued. Black people knew they had the right to sit where they wanted, live where they wanted, and go to school where they wanted. It was white people who had the problem and didn't know that black people already possessed these rights. In this respect, the civil rights movement and the legislation it helped create were for white people, according to Carmichael. Thus, rather than the white leftists and liberals of the movement weighing in to give approval to each new direction taken by the black activists of the movement, Carmichael argued that they needed to go into their own communities to confront racism. Arguably, the fact that this wholesale assault on the white problem never really happened is what conditions my mother's attitudes and the attitudes of countless people like her, who hold the example of the civil rights movement with the highest esteem and reverence, but nevertheless still harbor sentiments which rationalize the racial and political status quo. This is what I mean to say that the biggest problem on the left today is to establish the relevance of its history to the present and the opportunities and obstacles that we face today. Rather than assume that somewhere in the history of the left there is a forgotten slogan or formula that can be applied to the present, we need to address how the left's historical failures have let at least 2 generations of people pass without experiencing the politics of social change. While much of the activist world is simply fine with forgetting the relevance of the history of the left in favor of protest actions and incremental reforms, the left as a force for revolutionary transformation will remain irrelevant until it comes to terms with how its historical failure to render social change political has created this generation, which has great difficulty distinguishing between demanding rights that one already possesses but are denied in present conditions. And here I think, of the demand for justice, which is a kind of restoration of a status quo ante, and fighting for the power to create new conditions altogether. So with this problem in mind, I'm going to just do a very brief kind of historical account of the left and its kind of failings, and I'll try and keep it quick. We'll have time, hopefully, to talk about it more in the Q&A. But the left, in this country, as far as the socialist left, is largely foreign transplant. And the Marxist left, in particular, came over in the first instance after the revolutions of 1848, which were defeated in Europe, and so people were put into exile and they came here. So at a very early stage there was some incipient Marxist socialism in this country, but for the large period of the 19th century there really wasn't much of a homegrown socialism or Marxism that really deserves the name, at least not by comparison to the European standards. And at the same time that the American left was kind of in its infancy, the problems that would ultimately come to be at the center of the left's focus, especially regarding the race question, namely which kind of side of a long-standing antinomy in the history of black politics to support, or how to transcend the antinomy altogether, that between a separatist kind of perspective and an integrationist perspective, that these were all kind of developing at the same time. But before the left really grew in this country in the way that it did in the early 20th century, that problem, that antinomy, had already been largely established. And it does go back, you can even see it in something like the founding of the radical abolitionist paper, the North Star, which was founded by Martin Delany on the one hand and Frederick Douglass on the other. But in the early 20th century, the socialist movement in this country largely fell down on the issue of race. Famously, Debs said, we have nothing special to offer the black worker other than that which we offer the workers as a whole. And while I don't believe that Debs was a racist, and I think that comment actually points towards the potential that socialism had in the moment to address the working class as such, in practice, largely what that meant was that the interests of white workers as opposed to those of black workers, which is how it was pitted amongst the working class, were adopted by the socialist movement, and black workers were left on their own and suffered because of that. By the time of the Russian Revolution, there were forces present in the American left, largely in groups like the IWW, that showed the possibility for an interracial working class solidarity along revolutionary grounds. And much of this was absorbed by the founding of the Communist Party in 1919, which was actually founded in two separate contesting wings, but then was later conjoined into the Workers' Party of America under a kind of united leadership in, I think, 1921. And across the 20s, there was debate inside of the party around the question of what should the proper approach to the black problem be. And many historians see in this, a recapitulation of the history of the socialist movement, in that, for the large part of the 20s, really until 1928, there was nothing new advanced by the Marxist socialists. In 1928, there was a slogan put forth by the party for the self-determination of the black belt. But this slogan, we have to put it into a certain context of the development of the communist movement in this country, which was happening alongside and in conjunction with the development of the communist movement worldwide, largely to say the movement was in retreat and ultimately was defeated in many contexts. The struggle for socialism became confined within a national framework. By 1928, we have what is often described as a kind of Stalinization of the party. So this slogan for the national self-determination of the black belt also happened at a time in which a certain freedom of direction was being limited within the communist movement itself. By the 1930s, of course, we start dealing with the issue of the Great Depression and the New Deal, and it's in this context that the mobilization of African Americans, in particular the mobilization of African Americans along demands for economic equality and justice, were siphoned into the kind of rising wave of the Democratic Party, which historically the Democratic Party was the party of the Southern bigots, and the Republicans, were the party of Lincoln. But by this period, the old framework was no longer really holding, and in fact, for the sake of black Americans, it really hadn't held in some time. So by the 30s, there's this kind of, what we might call absorption of these militant protests that then really does carry forward into the 40s and 50s. And one of the people who informs my perspective on this, Harold Cruz, who's a historian he wrote an important book, in my mind, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, in 1969, that his perspective, for instance, is one that was developed in the 1940s as a kind of important intergenerational experience between the old left of the 30s, which was somewhat broken by the rise of the New Deal, and then what becomes the New Left in the 60s, which is largely inspired by the Civil Rights Movement. So what I'm getting at here is that there was a discontinuity between the generations of the old left and the new left, and that discontinuity is largely to be accounted for in the failings of the left itself, the failings to maintain an independent working class politics, and for that politics to address American issues such as racism.
And we need to.
Okay, give me 1 minute and I'll wrap it up. I tell this story of the early 20th century left because in it I believe is something of a cautionary tale for us today, which is that by the time of the 60s, something of that generational experience of defeat had been forgotten, and that the 60s in many ways felt it had to pick up where that earlier moment had left off, but at the same time found itself in opposition to it and appropriated certain aspects of it with greater and lesser degrees of self-consciousness. And so today we have that same problem, and that's what I was trying to get at earlier. I think that we suffer from a generational break between the 60s and the present, and in that vacuum, I think that the ideas of the left have been muddled and mixed with accommodation, and that the generation that today is mobilizing around issues that the left historically would have been seen as the predominant force in society capable of addressing them, that generation either has nothing to do with the left because they're within their rights to reject a failed set of experiences, or they're adopting aspects of it without really full awareness of where those ideologies were originally created, or when they were originally created. So today, I think, when we're addressing questions of state violence, for instance, which poses an enormous task on the left to not only reform police institutions and elect better mayors and better police commissioners and put body cameras on cops, all of which may be useful in some limited sense, but will not address, what Carmichael was trying to point us to addressing, namely those deep structured institutions which give rise to the possibility of police violations. That we in this kind of moment, we have to use history as a way of illuminating what we don't know. And we have to use history as a way of addressing the big problems. So, for instance, what would revolutionary politics look like in the context of trying to defeat the state violence perpetrated against black Americans today? Would it look like what's going on? Are we seeing an image of it in the present? Or does there need to be some sort of elaboration, development, transformation of the movement as currently established in order for that to come about? And what are the forces in society that are going to lead to that? What are the forces of society that are going to not only address within the black communities, black leadership and black initiative, but also what forces are going to address the white problem as it exists today? The left, predominantly, is a white institution, subculture, really, today. And so, the question is, where do our responsibilities lie as, quote-unquote, the left? So these are just questions that I wanted to raise, and I wanted to use this personal anecdote. I hope that it got at something bigger than just my own kind of time wasting on Facebook. And with that, I'll let the next speaker take over.
Frantz Fanon once said, "We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe." Sisters, brothers, comrades, friends, and enemies, the recent events cast a shadow on this discussion, on the very nature of American capitalism and racism. This past Sunday, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of the March in Selma, and the CEO of Empire, the Imperial President, Barack Hussein Obama, presided over that commemoration. In many ways, the reforms that was won through social struggle by the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement has been eradicated. And that is because, in the main concept that I want to pose today, is that those reforms that have been under threat is because we have not overthrown capitalism. We have not overthrown the 0.01% who controls and dictates American society and the world. This is evidenced by the Department of Justice's two reports. The first, a non-indictment on federal charges of not only Darren Wilson, but of Zimmerman as well in the Trayvon Martin case. But at the same time, they acknowledge the practice of slavery by another name, particularly in Ferguson, that of fines, parking tickets, arrests, harassment, court fees that plague the black working class and poor, basically being a siphon for revenue for Ferguson. And in fact, we can see in every other city and state around this country that same practice being done. In many ways, we have just bared witness to the fact that the police chief has announced in Ferguson that he will resign his office. I hearken back to the words of Malcolm X, who said one time, and I paraphrase, to acknowledge the knife is in the back of a person. That's what the report highlights in one respect of the Ferguson Police Department. But what about taking the knife out of the back and healing the wound that the blow made? That's the question. And so as we commemorated Selma, we saw Madison, Wisconsin explode in righteous indignation and anger at the shooting, death of Tony Robinson, who in fact at the same time as that shooting took place, Scott Walker had just proposed and now in passage the right to work law that seeks to break the back of the public and private sector unions. In fact, the killer of Robinson in 2007 also was engaged in another shooting of another unarmed person. Madison is interesting the same way as Ferguson, Missouri is interesting. Wisconsin has the highest rate of incarcerated black men in the country. They have one of the largest gaps of racial diversity in the police department. And in fact, it is the first state in the country to pass a law requiring the independent investigation of police and police custody cases. We are also reminded of the role of the press. We can think of the case of Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, the 12-year-old who the political establishment in Cleveland said it's his fault that he was shot by the police officer. Once again, posing the question not only in African-American communities but within the working class, the dichotomy of the angel and the devil to the angel. I raise these points to punctuate the idea that the root of this crisis and the rise of the elements of a police, prison, surveillance state is part of late-stage capitalism. What is done abroad, i.e. in Fallujah or in Afghanistan, is what is done here in the United States against its own populace. We're living in neoliberal capitalism. Power and profits are concentrated in the hands of the 0.01%. Even in our own city, there's 75 billionaires who live in New York. While at the same time, working class people pay 60% of their income to housing. That concentration of wealth dictates and determines the life of workers and youth in this country and in this city. Where profits is the main engine that drives this society and this world. And so they have to create the kind of structures to maintain that power. The institution of the military and the police is meant to defend, protect the property and the prestige of the ruling elite. The police was created to protect the new forms of wage labor that was created in the mid-19th century as the birth of a U.S. working class was being born. In the South, of course, the police is the direct descendants of the slave patrols. And of course, if we look at labor history, it is littered with examples of the role of the armed bodies of men, to use the term of Frederick Engels, under capitalism to break strikes and to, in fact, to punish the working class as they fought for better wages and working conditions. In fact, its two parties, Democrats and Republicans, has carried out the agenda, has inscribed the ideas of the ruling elite that 0.01%. Think about the surplus weaponry that is used, that is brought back from Afghanistan and Iraq and brought back to the cities and towns of this country. Both political parties in 1990 voted for the surplus weaponry to be brought back and to be used by police forces. Now, this is not the actions of faulty men or corrupt people, per se, but they are the byproduct of systems. And the one to which we live under today, capitalism, is the biggest bully and the biggest perpetrator of violence in the world. And so, with that, Diane Nash, one of the founding members of SNCC, did not go down to Selma. As she said, I will boycott because I don't want to march with George Bush, too. But if I was Diane, I would add Barack Obama to that list as well. Because the summit that he had after Ferguson and the 21st Century Task Force that had police commissioners, that had psychiatrists and other individuals to bring forth reforms to the police department. Of course, we know about the $260 million for body cameras. And in many ways, they came out with this proceduralism. What does that mean? It is described as such. Proceduralism assumes the problem is relatively few bad, corrupt, brutal, and or racist apples among cops who are inadequately trained, ineptly supervised, and somehow led to act like occupying armies by the absence of proper guidelines and leadership. Obama's task force and even his speech in Selma harkens back to the candidate Obama, which is very powerful. His oratory. He's a master of the oratory, of the rhetoric, and a skillful speaker. But at the same time, it is empty. Why do I say that? It is empty because the material conditions of black and brown people, and particularly the working class as a whole, has only gotten worse. As he's carried out the agenda of Wall Street, not one CEO has been indicted, charged, or even imprisoned for the economic meltdown in 2008-09. The victories of the civil rights movement was met, which unfortunately Ben didn't get into, but was met with violence, state violence. And we can think of the Black Panther Party, born in '66, SWAT, Special Weapons Tactical Force, was founded with the clear goal of shutting down the Black Panther Party. There were 279 military operations. 233 of them were directed at the Black Panther Party. We saw the rise of a prison state. Between the period of 1930 and 1970, there were only about 300,000 prisoners in the United States. But from 1970 up to now, we have 2.5 million prisoners, the highest in the industrialized world, more than in Stalin's Gulag or even in China. It took place at the time of the economic meltdown of the mid-1970s and the introduction of neoliberal capitalism. We have seen a slow and steady dismantling of the gains of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. In many ways, Obama provided confidence for young people, for workers and youth, and particularly for people of color, particularly black folk, who, if we look at the building of the White House by slave hands, for the first time now a black man could sit in the Oval Office. Yes, the racial attitudes have shifted. But the socialization of racism, which is etched in the DNA of American capitalism and global capitalism, it is taught and it is inscribed by the policies of the ruling elite and its two political parties, Democrats and Republicans. Which brings us to the black misleadership class. I don't have time to go deeper into it, maybe in the Q&A. But I think Norman Kelly, in his book, The Head Negro in Charge Syndrome, The Dead End of Black Politics in 2004, described what he terms the head Negro in charge. This is a condition in which self-appointed leaders, Al Sharpton, hijack the political process by somehow appealing to blacks' sense of collectivity while having an agenda that is mostly about themselves, making themselves the leaders. What Ferguson said to me in the protests over the past few months is that we're beginning to see the first phases of a challenging of the old leadership within the black community. Let's keep in mind that the black community is not this homogeneous community. There's different strands of thought and ideas that run through it. But what is important is that they're saying, you, Al Sharpton, you, Jesse Jackson, who once in the 1970s spoke of a black prophetic fire, you've profited off the system. You've in fact provided the system with this black leadership that was meant to keep us on lockdown, ideologically, methodologically, and organizationally. In 1968, there were 100 black elected officials at the time of Dr. King's assassination, April 4th, 1968. Today, it is in the thousands. But in many ways, like Obama's presidency, can that symbolism put food on the table? Can that symbolism send you to school free of charge? Can that symbolism rectify over 400 years of oppression and exploitation under capitalism? We are seeing that, in fact, even Obama's speech, Selma, one of the great battles on the question of voters' rights, helping Lyndon Johnson, in many ways, pass the Voting Rights Act of 65. Just most recently, a year ago, Clause 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act was gutted out. And Clause 4 and 5 is important. Why? Because those were the laws that forced states who had a history of discrimination and denying the vote for African Americans, they would have to be overseen by federal oversight. That was taken out of the law. So right now we are faced now, once again, with the question of voter suppression. Not just by Republicans, but even by Democrats as well. The struggle today, and I want to end on this point. Ben was quite, I find a little bit provocative on the question, what is the role of Marxists today? And I think Marxism has a very important role to play. It is, I agree with Ben actually, it is an uneven history of the left within this struggle. That is true. But there are also great examples within the labor movement. In fact, if we could think of the Russian Revolution as an example, the writings of Lenin and Trotsky, who had to deal with the question of the national oppressed minorities that was cobbled together to create the Tsarist regime, had written extensively about it. And in Lenin's second thesis to the Second International or Convention, he specifically talked about African Americans or black folks or Negroes, to use the term more accurately. And many within the Caribbean, many in the African diaspora had leaped and jumped to the Third International. Why? Because they were the cutting edge. They were different than the Second International that vacillated and pontificated on the question. But Lenin and Trotsky was much more dead on what was needed in the struggle, and also forging not just the right of self-determination, but in fact, class unity of the working class and poor. Yes, that history is uneven. In my organization, Socialist Alternative, and the Committee for Workers International, we've been writing a lot. We've made visits to Ferguson. And we've attempted to try to have dialogue with the working class and poor. We don't have all the answers, that's clear. But we are engaging into the movement. which is the key question facing any socialist worth anything. We must continue the protests. We must build and sustain organizations. We must highlight the question of ideas and demands in this movement. We've argued for a more broader movement of the working class and poor. Black Lives Matter is a powerful banner, but we know it has to be extended because black folks can't destroy this monster, can't defeat this monster by itself. I would say that the event in Madison is a great example where they took over the Capitol just a few days ago over the shooting of Tony Robinson, or the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina, where all the question of voter suppression and Black Lives Matter and women's reproductive rights, all in their tens and thousands, came out. Those are the kind of movements and struggles that we need to broaden out Black Lives Matter, to talk about not just black lives, but the quality of life for black workers and youth. The labor movement must play a role. Once again, there's a crisis of leadership in the labor movement because they're not even defending their own gains and their own institutions. But they're powerful. Why? Because they have human resources and economic resources. And they're spinning it in the wrong direction by continuing to be organizationally and theoretically linked to the Democratic Party. I would also submit the question of the fight for 15. Why do I say that? Because we know that we live in a service economy. And the majority of African Americans and people of color who have jobs or working jobs that are low wage. Since the collapse of the economic the meltdown and its so-called recovery, which is a weak recovery, in 2000, since that recovery, 67% of the jobs created have been low-wage jobs. Even in Ferguson, that's the dominant feature of the work in the area for a population of 21,000 people. And in many ways, the fight for 15 is a point of reference of how to struggle. Yes, it is a reform. Yes, it will not be able to stand by itself. But it's a point where we continue to build our movement on. The independence from the party is a big business. Social Alternative has the great example of Sharma Sawant, winning in Seattle, Washington. She's up for re-election. We're up for a big dog fight because the Democrats are going to oppose someone against her, a black woman actually, from the Urban League. But Sharma has done what most politicians have been unable to do in 2 or 3 terms. She's done in 1 year. We must end the abusive relationship with the Democratic Party. That's the question that's being posed to the Black Lives Matter movement. And my final point, in Loudoun County, since you raised Loudoun County, actually, they had learned the lessons of the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party and also the Atlantic City Convention in '64. And many of them came back and said, we don't want that. We don't want that example. Stokely and that leadership, who had learned from that defeat in some respects, came back and organized Loudoun County among sharecroppers and the farmers. And they ran in elections in '67, '68, and '69, even winning some seats. That's a great example, actually. But we must also have an ideological offensive against capitalism. And I would pose the question of democratic socialism. The polls have shown that the youth and African Americans are quite favorable to the ideas of socialism. Now, they don't know what that means in some respect. They don't know what that word means. But there's an open discussion about it. In the historical radical black freedom movement, there was various amount of different segments of that movement. Many of them were capitalists, many of them nationalists, revolutionary nationalists, but also many of them were socialists and communists. Many of them were leaders in the labor movement. E.D. Nixon, for example, who helped to launch the campaign of Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. We go on and on. It is our viewpoint that a system change is the only way to make black lives matter, to make working class lives matter. And I want to end, since this is the 50th anniversary of Malcolm's assassination and the 90th birthday, actually, May 19th, I want to end by quoting Malcolm. And in my opinion, the young generation of whites, blacks, browns, whatever else there is, you're living at a time of extremism, a time of revolution, a time when there's got to be a change. people in power have misused it, and now there has to be a change, and a better world has to be built. And the only way it's going to be built is with extreme methods. And I, for one, would join in with anyone. I don't care what color you are, as long as you want to change this miserable condition that exists on this earth. Thank you.
So hopefully we can get the screen going and the projector going. And just hang on for a second and see if it's going to magically happen and be quick. Okay, well, let's just see. Okay, so I'm going to wait for the screen to warm up a bit and talk for just a half second, and then I'm going to show some art, and then I'll talk for a little bit more. But I think the main thing I want to say, and I'm going to start with this and hopefully end with this, is we need revolution. We need revolution in communism. We don't need a lot of debate, although we do have a lot to discuss. We actually need the people, humanity needs to get rid of this system of capitalism, which is exploiting people and crushing and destroying lives. And there are many different manifestations of it, which we can see from Tamir Rice or the events in Palestine or Mike Brown. We can go into a lot of that. And hopefully we'll get into a little bit of it. But I think that, you know, in the final analysis, we don't need reforms. We don't need to put body cameras on cops. There are plenty of tactics people can talk about. But what we actually need is to get rid of this monstrous system that is crushing and destroying lives and is absolutely, at this era, unnecessary and outmoded. So I'm going to start with showing you a video, I hope. Oh, come on. Actually, let's do this. I'm going to stop this for a sec because the audio is not coming and the audio is important. So, yep. There's no audio right now, so it'll come out live when it comes in, so let's just see. There's not audio yet.
The Dred Scott decision. Opinion of Chief Justice Taney. Transcript of Dred Scott versus Sanford. 1857. December term. 1856. Dred Scott versus John F. A. Sanford. Dred Scott, plaintiff in error, v. John F. A. Sanford. Chapter 1. 1. Upon a writ of error to a circuit court of the United States, the transcript of the record of all proceedings in the case is brought before this court and is open to inspection and revision. 4. A free Negro of the African race, whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves, is not a citizen, within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States. 5. When the Constitution was adopted, they were not regarded in any of the states as members of the community which constituted the state, and were not numbered amongst its people or citizens. Consequently, the special rights and immunities guaranteed to citizens do not apply to them. And not being citizens within the meaning of the Constitution, they are not entitled to sue in that character in a court of the United States, where the circuit court has not jurisdiction in such a case. 6. The only two clauses in the Constitution which point to this race treat them as persons who it was morally lawful to deal in as articles of property and hold as slaves. 7. Since the adoption of the Constitution of the United States, no state can, by any subsequent law, make a foreigner or any other description of persons citizens of the United States, nor entitle them to the rights and privileges secured to that citizen by the instrument. 8. They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise, and trafficked whenever it was profit could be made, upon the same principles which prevailed at the time of the Declaration of Independence. As relates to these states, it is too plain for argument that they have never been regarded as part of the people, or the citizens of the state, nor supposed to possess any political rights which the dominant race might not withhold, or grant at their pleasure.
America enslaved millions of Africans, continued to enslave millions of their descendants after the Civil War, and currently imprisons 12% of their male descendants aged 20 to 34. Furthermore, 33% of African American men will be imprisoned during their lifetime, and many will face legalized discrimination. Neither presidential candidate plans to eliminate this mass imprisonment. A vote for either candidate implies acceptance of continuing this legacy. With knowledge and full understanding of this, I, state your name, will/will not vote in the 2012 presidential election. And so, entering into the booth, people were given instructions to fill out the questionnaire, but it also led into this saying, would you have voted during slavery, and would you vote in a segregated election? And the artwork that they were given was a restating of the questionnaire with a reproduction of the lithograph of Dred Scott, the historic Dred Scott, that was made during his lifetime, and instructions for people to extend the dialogue that happened in or not the dialogue, extend the ideas that happened in the performance into their home, to keep this up in their home and have conversations about it. And so that's I'm an artist. I wanted to show you one work of art. I don't want to actually go into a lot of different work, but I'll leave this up while I talk for just a second. We can have the lights on if somebody can get those. This was a piece of Dred Scott decision. It actually got into a country whose democracy is rooted in the subjugation and enslavement of other human beings. That's what America was founded on. It's founded on slavery and genocide. And any attempt to go back and try and salvage some bullshit democracy or whatever is going to actually be building on the foundations of a country whose concept of freedom means the enslavement of other people. there's absolutely no need to go back to such an outmoded idea that might have been radical in the 1700s, but is by today way past its time. America has brought us slavery, then it brought us Jim Crow, and now we have the new Jim Crow with 2.4 million people imprisoned. Time is up on this system. It is a horror. It is an absolute disaster for humanity. And, I think that, one of the things we're seeing right now, and I was actually glad to hear mention of Tony Robinson, because it actually does pose, the problem that black people are to America is intractable. It cannot solve that. You have a person who's basically chilling in his home, the cops bust in and pump him full of bullets, and he's dead. And then what do the cops do? They go and harass the witnesses that were his friends. They actually keep them in a holding cell, asking them questions. Supposedly they're free to go. But you know the situation. The cops just shot your friend, and you know what happened with Tamir Rice. You saw what happened with Ikai Gurley. You saw what happened with Mike Brown and Eric Garner, and you saw that the police got off even when caught on video camera. Even when caught on video camera. How free are you to fucking leave that prison or that jail cell where you're being questioned for witness information about the cops who just murdered your friend? So the other side of that is that actually people took over the State House, which was, I was glad to hear you mention, in the back. I was glad to hear you mention, because it's like, that's actually, it's like, what's on the agenda? There is a real rupture that people are seeing right now with looking at, traditional politics is actually not working for them. The reason we're actually even meeting in this room is because the people of Ferguson had the courage to stand up and say, no, we're not going to have another one. Mike Brown is not going to die in vain. We're going to stand up to your tear gas, your wooden bullets, your rubber bullets, your lying press, your arresting journalists. Your president comes there to tell people, just be calm and reflect on the situation. The first black president does that. No, these people stood up to all of that, and they inspired people around the country, and then when the non-indictment came in, they went back into the streets and were even more powerfully standing up to that, and people did that, in response to the non-indictment of Eric Garner, Daniel Pantaleo and the murder of Eric Garner. This is actually both what is needed right now, but actually looking at the, part of why I wanted to show this piece is it gets back to the history of this country and what it's founded on. It's like, this is not just a question of, the Republicans or the Democrats are not doing good right now. This is a country that was founded on exploitation and slavery. Okay, that's what it was founded on and what it works on today. The argument that the Dred Scott decision, which I encourage everybody to read, the Supreme Court justice that wrote that decision, made the most well-thought-out, articulate, elaborated argument for white supremacy I have ever read. Now, obviously, I don't agree with his conclusion, but I do agree with his analysis of what the U.S. Constitution was, the Declaration of Independence was, and what the so-called Founding Fathers meant. They did not think of me and my ancestors as human beings. They thought of us as property. They thought of us as chattel. They thought of us as tools to help them get wealthy. The Constitution was written by slave owners and friends of slave owners to defend the system and extend the system of slavery. Okay, that was the economic base of America. Right now, it's no longer the economic base. We have a system of capitalism, which again is crushing and destroying lives around the planet. And so the situation with the police, which people are sharply coming up against and courageously battling against, which is really great, is, something that people are confronting. Some people are saying, this whole, there are a few bad apples or something like that. That's not the case. It's the system they serve trains them to be that way. The system they serve trains them to do what they do. And I just want to read a quote, actually, a very brief thing from Bob Avakian, who's the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party. He said, the role of the police is not to serve and protect the people. It is to serve and protect the system that rules over the people, to enforce the relations of exploitation and oppression, the conditions of poverty, misery, and degradation into which the system has cast people and is determined to keep people in. The law and order the police are about, with all their brutality and murder, is the law and order that enforces all this oppression and madness. I mean, it's like, that actually is concentrating a lot of what the police do and why people are coming up again. How is it that within 1 second of arriving on the scene, a young 12-year-old boy who's sitting in a park by himself with a toy gun can be dead? Is that an accident, or is that the very functioning of the system and the cops who are trained to actually view the people in general, including black people specifically, with contempt and hatred? And when they don't have they can't even bring themselves to say, we are sorry, but actually blame him for his own death. This is what we're living through. And so, I think that I just want to pose a couple questions because, I do want to actually get your questions and get into it. But I want to pose two things. That, the hour is very late. People in October, November, and December of last year, the end of October, but through the non-indictment of Darren Wilson up through the end of the year, fought with determination that rocked this country to its foundations. It was beautiful to see. Under the hashtag of Black Lives Matter, but it was a lot of different political ideas were throwing into that, and very good. That has been put on the defensive, particularly after the 2 cops got murdered and the mayor got on this TV, but also the media started saying, oh, well, black lives and blue lives are the same. We have to feel sorry for these cops. We have to chill out the protests and all that stuff. It is absolutely vital and essential to re-seize the initiative that was gained when people were shutting down highways, they were shutting down police stations, they were shutting down shopping centers, they were doing die-ins from Princeton to high schools all around the country. People acted with a lot of courage and heart. We need to re-seize that initiative. On April 14th, there's been a call put out by the Stop Mass Incarceration Network to stop business as usual around the country. We will not go back, no school, no work, say no more to the system giving the green light to killer cops. And so I have a few of the short flyers for this. But anybody with a sense of humanity, anybody who wants any justice and does not want to live in a world where the police are murdering black folk and given a green light to do it time and again and again and again and again, needs to be actively organizing right now and be out on the streets on the 14th. There should be walkouts from SVA. And I'm sure that this will be controversial. I've spoken at SVA a couple of times. It's a mix. I mean, some of the students I met are really great. I'm glad you all came out tonight. And then some of the students I've met here are like, hey man, I just got to figure out how I can get my degree so I can get that job. And it's like, yes, conditions are hard out there. You got a lot of debt, you go to this school, But actually, do you want to live in a world where the cops are brutalizing and murdering people and locking up people with just absolutely no regard for the effect that it's destroying on people's lives? The other thing I want to pose is that, as I started out saying, we need revolution in communism. The question of how humanity is going to get free, not just how we're going to stop the police from murdering people, but how we can actually get to a world we really want to live in, requires theory. It requires actually wrangling with both what has happened in the past and what are the past experiences of past revolution and past socialist society, but also where can things go in the future. And I read a brief quote from Bob Avakian, looking at the situation, the role of the police, but there was a 4-hour talk between him and Cornel West going at the question of the revolution in religion, the role of religion in the fight for emancipation. That was deep. There was about 2,000 people that went up to Riverside Church on November 15th. And actually each of the speakers sort of presciently called out before these non-indictments came down that people needed to be in the streets and bring America to a halt, which people did. Not so much because those 2,000 people heard the speech and went out and did it, but it's like these brothers are deep revolutionaries and given their heart to the people, and Avakian in particular has really given 40 years of his life to summing up the past history of revolutions and looking and developing theory and a whole new synthesis on communism that is actually both viable and desirable. And so there's a film of that's actually out called Revolution and Religion, like this. I got a card for it right here. People who want it can come get them. But it's going to be on March 28th. It's going to be available on the internet. There's a sort of preview version, a trailer on now, but it's also going to have screenings around the country. There's one at the Schomburg Center, which I would encourage you to be at. If you're really agonized and vexed by how can we actually stop this beast and how can we get to a radically different world, these guys were going at it with a lot of heart. And so I would say you should be in the audience at the Schomburg Center on the 28th at, I think 4 o'clock it is. 4 o'clock, 4 to 9 at the Schomburg Center. And I will just end again, saying we don't actually have to have a world where a tiny handful of people controls the great wealth and knowledge that humanity as a whole has created. It matters tremendously whether people eat. And revolution in the past socialist societies, there's a lot to stand on that. These were not a lot of horrors. We can get into the particulars of, it's like somebody was saying, the whole Stalinist gulags. Well, it's real easy to hate on Stalin, and often that's quickly, hate on Stalin, hate on Hitler. But most people actually don't know that much about the history of the Soviet Union and what some of the contradictions were being faced. I'm not a huge Joseph Stalin fan, but I actually think the Soviet Union was socialist at that time, and we should get into what is to be upheld and what do you do so you don't go into those situations where you have gulags again. If you're actually talking about we need revolution, we need to get rid of capitalism, we need a dictatorship of the proletariat, well, what's that going to look like? How is that going to be administered? How is that going to be wielded? How is that going to be run? What is this new society? And so, as I said, Avakian gets into some of that, both in this talk, but in a lot of other writings, and I would strongly encourage you to come on the 28th. So, let's talk.
So we've invited a member or some members of the Black Student Union to pose the first question, and we'll have the panel respond to that and then open it up for questions from the audience.
Hello, I'm Gerald. I'm the Vice President of the Black Student Union. And the question I asked, I guess because the points were relatively brought up by all three of you, is that the system wasn't built for us, for black people. And so, you know, how do you engage with those political leaders? Is it necessary? And what are the strategies for attacking these issues? And when politicians and when the media sort of kind of dismisses a lot of things, like when cops are killing black people, you know, just like on Morning Joe when they blame rap for you know, for like
Must be the music,
yeah,
yes.
must be the music for these kids in Oklahoma raising a racist chants. So, like, how do we attack those head on, or is it necessary? Because, like you said, the system wasn't ever built for us, you know, but it profits a lot, and it continues to profit a lot based off free labor. And that's just a shotgun that you take.
How do you want to handle the...
Dred, it seems like you're...
Yeah, I mean, I think, first off, you know, I think that there are real lessons for when people have sort of fought back. That I think that, you know, trying to have dialogue with or sit down with the politician, I mean, it's like, look, Malcolm X said, you know, he basically viewed this system as his enemy. He was not actually trying to figure out how can I have a sit down with the president. In fact, he was actually critical of a lot of black leaders. He said, look, in the Ballad of the Bully, he said one of the first things that the new leader does when he comes to town is he invites the black leaders for coffee. And he said the black leaders, couldn't pass up the coffee, and because they were trying to actually say, well, how could we? The system was the president, was trying to figure out how can I get Martin Luther King or all these other people to actually chill out the struggle of people who were starting to fight back against this system in ways that could get out of hand for the system. And X was actually saying, no, we actually don't want to do that. We need change. Now, I don't subscribe to a lot of his program for how that change was going to happen, but I do think the real fundamental thing of this system is our enemy. It is actually, there's no way to reform it. Yes, reforms have happened. Yes, it is absolutely different now to not be chattel slaves than to be chattel slaves. But that wasn't ended through some polite discussions. That actually took a civil war, and it wasn't as if the North invaded the South to end a system it opposed. The South seceded and the North said, no, we're actually going to change up the economy to be more fully capitalist. And Lincoln straight up said, look, if I could keep the Union together by freeing the slaves, I'd do it. If I could free some of the slaves, I'd do it. If I could free none of the slaves, I'd do it. He didn't care about slavery. He cared about it in terms of whether it actually, ruptured the unity of the Union, but he didn't care about it as an institution, certainly not morally. And so I don't think the point is to, let's try and figure out how to get with lead. Obama, as you pointed out, on the speech on Selma, here's the descendant of the people who were beating people down on Selma, at Selma, saying, all right, this is all good. We got some work to do, but it's basically good. As he's presiding over the murders of Mike Brown and presiding over the murders of Eric Garner. No, we don't want to sit down with them. We actually need to do what the Black Lives Matter movement said. No, we're going to shut this country down. Now, that, I think, needs to be part of a broader thing of building a movement for revolution. We need revolution, we need revolution, we need revolution. And if we aren't actually doing that, then we're going to be having this conversation in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or 50 years or 100 years, and because we're going to be up against the same thing, that this is a system that is based on exploitation. And so, we actually need to build a movement of people that are determined and willing to lead people when the time is right to get rid of this system. And as part of that, we do need to bounce back and fight back against particular injustices and outrages, like what's happening around the police murders. We actually need to win some victories in that. But I mean, part of the thing is these tactics that get thrown out to people is like, we got to get body cameras on cops. Well, god damn it, they had a fucking body camera. I mean, they had a camera on the cop five cops who choked to death Eric Garner. They also had a camera when they, had, Oscar Grant killed. There was a camera on that. There were several cell phones that captured that. There were plenty of cops that, there's a camera that captured the murder of Tamir Rice. They haven't indicted him yet. They can't even indict. This system will not do that. And so we actually need to get focused on getting more and more out of control of the system. And then in that context, the system actually suddenly will say, well, maybe we better start chilling the cops out.
Jed, I think that Eljeer had a response to this as well.
Yeah. I think on the question of police violence, this is Obama's Hurricane Katrina. He's paralyzed. He doesn't know what to do. I thought it was very interesting that both of them were on the stage, Bush and Obama, particularly centered around the existence of black life and the denial of black life. There was a summit. There were youth from Ferguson who went to and some of the folks were handpicked, actually, to go sit down with the president. We would not advocate, to be honest with you, we would not advocate a sit down with the president. But if we were invited, this happened chance, hypothetically, if we were invited, we would send our city council representative, Shama Sawant, and she would, because she's part of a democratic organization, she would raise the questions about the economy, Black Lives Matter, and that this falls on the doorstep of the White House and Wall Street. So if we had the opportunity, we would take the opportunity as a platform to raise working class issues and demands. With that said, I agree with the brother. We need a broader movement, but now, and we need those victories as well. We have to understand that consciousness is always in flux, it's always moving. It's never static. And so, for example, if you think about the foreclosure movement, Minneapolis had profound foreclosures among people of color in particular, working class people, middle class people, and there were folks that probably were not engaged in politics. But then the foreclosure situation erupted, the housing bubble burst, and these people found themselves now organizing and mobilizing to save their homes. And in many ways, that's how consciousness and that's how the mood is going to change. From our standpoint, we want to have that dialogue with working people. We want to get a sense of where they're at. Because what is today won't be tomorrow. And in many ways, it's not going to be socialist alternative that's going to make the revolution. It's going to be the working class and the poor that will make that revolutionary process take place. Now, we would argue that we also need multiple approaches to the struggle as well. In the labor movement, on the shop floor, which is one of the most undemocratic places on this planet, the workplace. We think about, of course, our communities. We think about our schools, in fact, that are under threat, public education in particular. The question of even elections. Some people would say, elections, it doesn't matter. What does it matter, right? We've got two parties. It's the oligarchs. They control everything. Okay. But if you put forward a working class position, for example, Shama Sawant, every city councilor in Seattle makes $100,000 a year. She brings home $40,000 a year. Everything else goes back into building social movements and social justice organizations. She lives and eats just the way working class people eat and sleep. At the same time, she's underneath the direction of an organization and the movement as a whole. She came out of the Occupy movement. And so we, after Occupy Wall Street, we put out the call for 200 Occupy candidates to run against the Democrats and Republicans. Not so much to get into the system as, we're representatives now. No, we know that parliamentary means will not bring forward the downfall of capitalism. We're clear about that. But at the same time, that's a platform for working class people to hear ideas, to hear their voice, their interests being heard, that maybe in some other spheres they would not be heard. And so Committee for Workers International has representatives all around the world, and we live by that same mandate, that we are working class representatives with socialist ideas and a socialist program.
Yeah, I mean, you posed the question as to what do you do with the system that wasn't built for you, and I think that one of the ways that we have to address the kind of question of historical inheritance and what being an American, quote unquote, is about is that the system was made by African Americans. Well, they weren't African Americans; they were Africans, really, and then later by a population of slaves who were born here, and that they're the foundation of the nation in terms of their labors built, this society, and then of course the working classes. I mean, one thing though that I would want us to get into a little bit further is what do we mean by these kind of terms such as the system, right? Because I, for one, have a problem with that term being used, and this is perhaps what I was trying to get at a little bit in my call for us to not just uncritically inherit language and ideas from the kind of past upsurges of political movements against the status quo in the past, because of course the system. When we refer to that, we could be referring to a host of things, and these are complicated historical phenomena, which we don't necessarily need to know the ins and outs of as activists in our day-to-day, but which nevertheless the theoretical requirements that Dred was pointing to earlier, push us to examine. So, for instance, I think that the idea that the state and the society that the state is a function of are identical is not necessarily borne out in an analysis that accounts for the rise of the state and the rise of capitalism. The American state as such was born before the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution has fundamentally, along with the Civil War and emancipation, has fundamentally changed the nature of the problems faced by an emancipatory politics in the present. Such that, as I think was mentioned, it took a civil war to end slavery, but the Civil War is in many ways not over. And I think that there's something behind a slogan brought up by another kind of Trotskyist group, and probably maybe adopted by members here on this panel. Finish the Civil War. What would that mean in the present? What would it mean for the transformation of the democratic institutions of this country towards? And then the question is towards what end? Because not only was the Civil War opening onto a reshifting of the nature of those institutions, and then Reconstruction even further bringing out that possibility, but it was also defeated, and in that defeat lies much of the structures that we inhabit today, from racial ones to labor ones and economic ones, and also political ones. I mean, the structuring of the party system in this country is in many ways founded upon the defeat of the Reconstruction era. Now, one can't simply say, well, we need to go back and just pick up where the demands being posed by radical, black and white, politicians in that era, what they were demanding, because of course times have changed yet even further since then. And so I think that the question is, yes, we have to look at the past as something that we inherit critically, while at the same time recognizing that the direction between our present moment, which is something again I was trying to highlight, and that past. We talk about the fact that there's been a dismantling of the New Deal kind of arrangement in society. I mean, it doesn't exist the way that it did when it was at its high moment, which happened to correspond with the high peak of civil rights activism. One of the terrible ironies and tragedies, perhaps, of the trajectory of the civil rights movement is by the time there's this kind of radicalism being brought out in the different sections of the late 60s and early 70s of the civil rights movement, it's precisely at that time that there's a great dismantling beginning of the economic and inclusive political institutions, quote unquote, that were brought about by the New Deal. And I, for one, don't think that we should be trying to go back to a New Deal arrangement. I think that we need to be inventive, and we need to see the present moment as, in a way, freed because of its separation from the past. And so the question is then, well, what do these historical ideologies offer to us? What does Black nationalism offer to us? What does Marxism offer to us? And all of its different and competing tendencies, because these aren't, even when you refer to like revolutionary Marxism, I mean, there differences of opinion on this panel. 3 people, you could ask each one of us, who do you look to as an example of revolutionary Marxism? You're going to get different answers. So in that, there's, I think, something to be addressed as far as, how do we learn not from, the victories of the past, which have given us little in terms of what we possess today in the present. But I think more importantly, how do we learn from the failures of the past, which actually have created the conditions of the present? I mean, the victories, we should not forget them, and we should not disparage them. But we have to recognize that, the bourgeois, the radical bourgeois Adam Clayton Powell Black Power idea is what went out in many ways over the Stokely Carmichael idea, and it became a question of Black Power representatives as elected representatives of a kind of identitarianly cohesive community, which never existed in the first place. I mean, to the point about Jesse Jackson. How do we address the fact that it was precisely on that great momentum of the '60s that Jesse Jackson was able to build his house? And if we're going to dismantle that house, we're going to have to get down to that foundation. And so I think that we have a very complicated task in front of us that can't necessarily abide by these old kind of paradigms of it's the system. I just don't see that as sufficient any longer. And not even really sufficient for rallying people, because I think that the left holds on to these rallying cries, but not to great effect. And, I don't see, I for one think there's an enormous amount to learn from the history of Lenin and Trotsky. But I don't see going out onto a square filled with Occupy Wall Street protesters or Black Lives Matter protesters and trying to get them to acknowledge the relevancy of Lenin is going to advance the movement. So we do it here in this group. So how are we going to get the relevancy of that history forward into the present? Sorry.
Over there in the gray.
Excuse me. The terms race and racism have quite understandably been used pretty frequently in this discussion thus far. And I wanted very simply to ask if, of the three panelists, if you might apply a sort of a more pointed or acute lens, for lack of a better word. If we might sort of disenchant these terms and what they mean and what the categories have, how they've come to be understood historically and so forth over the course of the struggles of say the 19th and the 20th centuries, and what it is precisely that they mean to each of you individually today.
Would you like to just go down the table?
Sure. I think that any category of analysis, or theoretical category, has its kind of correspondent referent in a world that is in motion. We talk about class, and I think it was E.P. Thompson who had a great word on this. He's like, well, you try and find class, and all you find is the whistles and the machinery clanks and everything else that constitutes that dynamic that we refer to in static way as class and class relations. And I think, in large part that's also true of race. I think that there's theoretically differences in the analysis and the kind of objects of analysis between analysis of class and race. I don't think, for instance, class is a question of identity so much as a social function. And, race also has functioned that way historically, although, largely and more to the point, I think that it becomes associated with this concept of identity, so that one is black or one is white. And that doesn't necessarily refer to a system in motion or a structure in motion. But yeah, as far as what do we mean by race and racism, I think we live in a world which has transformed in that no longer, well, it's not exactly the case, but in large part no longer is there some sort of biological explanation that describes what we mean when we talk about race. Genetic studies and everything else have beyond the shadow of a doubt proven that this is bullshit. That we are not substantially divided along racial lines as a species. But what does that, it doesn't really matter all that much to the extent to which, the social structures that are in place continue to perpetuate the consciousness of our separation as distinct races. So, what is race and racism? Well, it's, a myriad of social constructs that are inherited historically, that, we choose to either use as an explanative kind of tool, or we combat and contest, depending on the situation. And so, that's again, just more call to examine our terminology in light of the history that's created it, because it's not a natural thing. I mean, there's no natural thing such as race and racism. It had to be made. It's something made, and so the question is, well, what do we do with that product of the history of humanity? So, anyways,
I just think it's not that fucking complicated. I mean, I'm sorry. It's, if the framework of the question is what is race, what is racism, I mean, the police fucking know what is race and what is racism when they pump bullets into people that, interestingly enough, have darker skin than the lighter skinned people. It's not that hard. We're in a room that's in part being hosted by the Black Student Union. I mean, it's like, let's not complicate. The problem isn't that we don't have an understanding of race. That's not the problem. The problem is actually that we don't have a movement for revolution, and that people are actually, I mean, and frankly, the thing of, it's like, yeah, we need to get more specific on what we mean when we talk about the system, but it's, again, not that complicated. And right now we're witnessing sort of a movement which, on the one hand, there was a lot of spontaneity to it, but there's a lot of basis for why that spontaneity existed. Ferguson could have happened 2 years earlier or 5 years later, it might not have happened in Ferguson, Missouri. It might have happened in some other small town outside of California or something like that, or outside of Newark. But it was, I mean, you could look at the seeds of what are going into it, and it's not that hard. The question is, now that that's been thrown up in the air for the world to see, do we actually fight with everything we can to further that rupture open and bring as many people as possible out into the streets and challenge them to the bottom of their soul? And yes, we do actually need theory and theoretical work. I am really, really, really advocating people get further into, go to revcom.us to check out Bob Avakian. The dude is badass. He came out he was friends with the Panthers, and they got him into revolution. We do need theory, but let's not complicate this. The people of Ferguson aren't actually having a debate about what is race. They were like, we know the police are shooting us down. We need to stop it. We're in the streets. And people responded to that. Please, let's do that. And then on the basis of that, let's have conversations.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question to that?
Sure.
I'm just, the Revolutionary Communist Party went down to Ferguson, and they didn't necessarily find a lot of welcome when they went there and promoted Bob Avakian. And I think that there's probably a great deal to be learned in the past 40 years of work of Bob Avakian, but why didn't people there necessarily see it at the outset?
Well, that's an interesting statement, and how many people have the basis to evaluate whether that's true or not? In this room, okay, you got 4 people who say, I have certain verifiable proof, I can understand how the people of Ferguson responded to the Revolutionary Communist Party when they went down there.
People is probably too broad. There were people who didn't appreciate it.
There were people who didn't and many who did. Part of Ferguson action was actually built through some of the struggles of people going down and saying, look, we actually need revolution. We support the people who were taking the most courageous stands out there, and it was inspiring to them and empowering to them and getting people into a means of where they could actually take the spontaneous upsurge and take it even further and give people a grounding in whether it was just the horrific situation that they knew they were up against in Ferguson, with the people just being stopped all the time and fined all the time and jailed all the time and over petty shit. They knew that, but then figuring out how does this sit in the broader country and how do we actually go further? That was something that a lot of people did actually appreciate. And so this bullshit about, nobody likes the RCP or Avakian, that's just not fucking true. Some people don't and some people do.
Eljeer?
Yeah. I was in Ferguson back in October, and I would say in general, not just RCP, there's an anti-party mood that does exist among the youth. They're upset. They're dejected by the parties, particularly the establishment parties, Democrats and Republicans. And then you throw in the left in the United States, which is a long story, and long, complicated problem that the left in the United States has, to be really honest with you. But I think what's interesting is that we're seeing, even in Ferguson, levels of sectarianism coming out. Many of the organizations are run by NGOs. They're getting grant money from George Soros, the multi-billionaire, Organization of Black Struggle in particular. And so we have a lot of deep questions being posed to the people of Ferguson, particularly the youth of Ferguson, that went out to the street and that defied the law in many respects. Now, the question on the race and racism, I think I would look at it from the standpoint that we've been inundated with the whole question of post-racial America. And I think in many ways we have to tackle that to squarely say, no, we're not post-racial. We've always been of a racial, there's always been a racial character to the United States. But also it has also been of a class, gender, and also sexuality, particular question. Now, as Marxists, we try to link the threads of that movement to have more overarching analysis of the system of capitalism that dominates the ideas in the society. Because I think race, and it's already been proven, biologically does not exist. It is, and I agree with Ben, it is a social construct that policies are developed and inscribed the power of the elite and its institutions. So in many ways, how do we counteract that? We must first of all acknowledge race still matters, right? That we also at the same time have to say that it is a byproduct of the capitalist system that is that determines what we read, what we see on television. It's not an accident, mind you, that the New York Times wrote a piece about Mike Brown saying that he's not an angel, right? So they wanted to set it up, not so much for black folks, but they wanted to set it up for folks who are kind of on the fence, who are just looking, who are observers, who are not really involved in the struggle. So they come away saying, oh, there you go, another black little menace once again. Or the way they talk about Tamir Rice. He caused his own death. Once again, in a very sensational way, in a manner that really doesn't get to the heart of the key question of the role of the state apparatus, the rise of elements of a police state, of surveillance. Obama, who has carried out one of the most explosive cases of attacks on whistleblowers. He has used the Espionage Act more than any other president in modern history. The question of the NSA. All of these processes are taking place under a black president. So we have to unpack race. We have to analyze it again. But at the same time, we have to say that the only way that we're going to be able to dismantle that is by really hitting at the heart, that what created it, the whole idea. I urge people to read Gibran Khalil Mohammed's book, Condemnation of Blackness, which I think is very important in understanding when we think of crime, when we think of criminality in the United States, particularly in the period after Reconstruction. And in many ways, what we think of race, I think, really flows out of that process.
Richard?
Yeah, so this was actually prompted by Brett's video and then comment. So I had a historic question first for the panel, and then a kind of present-oriented question and comment. So the historical question is, do the panelists think that I know that, for example, Karl Marx endorsed Abraham Lincoln's re-election. Do the panelists think that black people in the United States had a stake in the Civil War? That's the historical question. And the present-oriented question is, and again, prompted by Dred's question, was the phrase "shook America," speaking of Black Lives Matter, which is obviously big for a political movement, the biggest thing since Occupy, shook America to its foundations. That, to me, for all of my sympathy for it, seems a huge exaggeration. But I just would like comment. And I guess the other thing that I didn't hear was this has been a discussion of race in America, which has historically been black and white. But where do people who are not white but not black fit in? I mean, I've been living in a city, for example, that's 50% Puerto Rican and 50% white. And I think that's a very important thing because I think we're approaching a society where maybe the majority of non-white people are not black. And that's something.
We're beyond that. I mean, black are not the largest majority of
well,
minorities.
I don't know. Well, it depends how you define it. Whatever. I mean, the actual number. But anyway, that's the and sort of how those people fit in to this racial hierarchy.
Shall we go down the table or down there?
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah, it was more directed at you, Dred. I'm happy to answer as well.
Go
ahead.
1, 2, 3.
Okay. Sure. The Civil War, in many respects, had elements of a liberation struggle, particularly when African Americans or Africans got involved really in the struggle. Marx was correct. He saw that, in fact, he writes in Capital, there's a passage, white skin will not be liberated as long as black skin is branded. He advocated, he had discussions with Lincoln, or shared letters, I should say. Many of his supporters, the early supporters, as Ben had pointed out, who came over, who had played a role, or youth during the 1848 revolutions of that time. And so there had correspondence between Marx and Engels, and they saw this as a very important struggle. Reconstruction, in many ways, was probably the last gasp of opportunity where we could have seen a democratic society, perhaps, that's multiracial, to use that term, multiracial in scope. But that was, of course, the betrayal of 1877 and so forth. Black Lives Matter because it provides us with a starting point, right? It's an affirmation of our lives, particularly youth, that over the past 40, 50 years has seen the ascendancy of a black middle class, right, with the dismantling of Jim Crow America, seen that black middle class rise, which is a tiny segment of the U.S. population, but the black underclass, the black poor, black working class, still struggling. If we look at King, for example, and the work that he did after the voting rights in '65, Diane Nash, one of the more militants within SNCC, one of the more militant side of the civil rights movement, also along with James Bevel, had urged the question about poverty, dealing with those type of questions. So Black Lives Matter, if it's going to really become a movement that we want to see, it's going to have to begin to theoretically and organizationally, but also in a more pragmatic way, deal with the pressing issues of the material conditions that working people face, and particularly black workers face. I agree, actually. I think the conversation that we're having harkens back to the 50s and 60s in the sense of black-white relations. The American population now is far more diverse. It's far more intriguing. For example, you have not seen in Black Lives Matter the role of the immigrant population into the movement. Now, they have a serious stake to play in this movement, because they also have been, their movement was crushed after the 2006-2007 basically general strikes that took place of the immigrant rights movement, crushed by ICE, crushed by a militarized police force that sought to dismantle that powerful movement that had great potential, in fact. And so we're seeing those changing demographics, and they're posed with a lot of questions, too, about the surveillance state, about prisons. We talk about 2.5 million prisoners in the United States. There's 300,000 immigrants who are held in dungeons in America, which a lot of people don't even talk about, actually.
Work camps, really.
Work camps, yeah. Seattle and Washington. The young Mexican brother was gunned down in Pasco, Washington, you know. Not a lot of press on that. That's why our movement has to be not just broad, but has to be say, you know what? We can't play the game of divide and conquer. My oppression is worse than yours, right? We have to be able to say the oppression is real on both sides. We have to come together, because that's the game of the ruling elite, that divide and conquer game, you know. And they love to see a fragmented movement, you know, because they can pick off people one by one. Black Lives Matter is in the deep question. It's in deep crisis, I think, a little bit, actually, and I will pose that.
I mean, on the Civil War, yes, sort of black people, enslaved Africans, and free people of color had a tremendous stake in the outcome of that, and fought tremendously and died in greater percentage, you know, per capita numbers than white people. And, you know, it really mattered whether sort of, you know, the system of slavery was ended. That, you know, and that's particularly why when people had a chance, they left the plantations and went to fight with whatever tools they had at hand, and if they could get into the Union Army, which initially was really difficult. The Union didn't want to, the Federal Army did not want to take the enslaved people in. You know, that is very important. But that said, you know, I mean, you're posing look, you know, Reconstruction, actually, we could have had a democratic society. Well, we would have had a democratic capitalist society. It was a bourgeois revolution that Civil War was trying to complete, and did in some ways complete. And while ending slavery is very important, you know, we can't hearken back to, can we get a slightly better version of capitalism? You know, it's like, you know, there's, you know, one of the, you know, Michelle Alexander's, you know, the new Jim Crow, it actually really gets at how you have a system which, by and large, you don't have, you know, you don't have a judge going into the courtroom and saying "hello niggers" when he actually has a trial. You know, during the Emmett Till trial, that's how the judge greeted the black people of the town that came to the trial. You don't have that anymore. You don't have judges and lawyers that are openly and overtly racist. Yet you do have a system that imprisons over 1 million Black and Latino people. It's like and so how is it? So she's going at it. We have a democratic society, and I'm not that enamored with it. It's not like let's try and perfect this and just try and extend some of this, holy writ from the Constitution. It's not. The capitalism is not any good, and it's not something we should be concerning ourselves with. How can we perfect, or hearkening back to what could have happened had Reconstruction been done a little bit better, and had the North had an interest in actually meeting the interests of Black people, as opposed to crushing the economic system in the South and actually then re-enslaving people effectively through the years up to World War II. And so Black people did have a stake in the ending of slavery, but it's not a stake that I think is something that we should celebrate. Like, okay, we ended that, and that really makes us suddenly part of America. And so on the question of shaking America to its foundation, in a certain sense that's a bit of hyperbole, but actually it's not. I think that the upsurge around the unindicted police killings was something that even more than Occupy, actually, not even since Occupy, but even more than Occupy, hit at a question of people who've been fundamentally shut out and locked down in this system, and this system has no answer for. This system has no answer for all the people that are currently in prison, but also millions of Black youth who have no jobs and no potential for getting jobs. This system cannot and will not meet those needs. It both has an ideology which is antithetical to that of white supremacy, but it actually economically can't do it. The largest growing job in the country right now is cashier. You're not going to feed a family on that. I have friends in East New York that are caught up in the hell of the violence that's there, much of which is stirred up by the cops, but it's not only the cops, because a lot of the youth are into some foul shit, but they can't raise a family. I know somebody who looked for work every day for a year, was taking his resume around to McDonald's. His dream job was a security guard. He couldn't find work. He eventually did, which was great. But that story is over and over and over again. And so I think that when those people started moving and saying we have nothing to lose by going out into the streets and standing up to your militarized tanks, and other people came into the streets, and I've been in New York for about 23 years now. I don't know of any other time when the FDR was shut down. I've been to a lot of protests. The bridges were shut down. I remember once when the West Side Highways were shut down. There was so much shutting down in New York City that it was inspiring to people, and that got shoved back into the bag of people figuring out, oh well, maybe we went too far or whatever. But there were a lot of people, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands perhaps, active, in moving, and millions of people paying close attention and hoping for a different resolution, because they suddenly had the veneer of this system ripped away, and they saw, wait a minute, they killed the brother on film, and this system won't even prosecute. There's something wrong here. And so I think that was actually very destabilizing, and we have to work to bring that understanding back to people who are conveniently now forgetting that. And then on the question of being more multi-ethnic society, yeah, I think that we actually have a lot of work to do on how to both frame our language that encompasses people from different nationalities and different immigration statuses. As you pointed out, the 300,000 people that are in prison. Obama's the biggest deporter of any president ever. And the conditions the private prison industry is the way they're building prisons to, parasitically feed off the, people that are immigrants, and the way people were deported, and the xenophobia and racism that's directed at them is very big, and there's a potential wellspring of strength there if we actually, if we can do our work better on that question.
Ben?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I guess on the question of the Civil War, I think that
I started one over there. Thanks.
I think that too often is it posed in terms of, well, did it was Lincoln trying to end slavery or was he not? I think first of all the slaves knew that the war was over slavery. The slaves knew that was a distinct possible outcome, that they would either be emancipated or that the system would be maintained under the auspices of the Confederate States. And I think that the slave owners knew that was, what was in play in that. And I think that it became even more the case, as both my fellow speakers have pointed out, it became even more the case the degree to which the slave population and the free black population, allied with radical abolitionists, made it the case. Nothing is anything unless it's made to be that. The system, whatever, is not going to change on its own accord in directions sought by those, trying to increase freedom, just because. It's always been a question of it being compelled to transform, so the question is always, how? Through reform, through revolution, what have you. As far as like the question of is it hyperbole to say, is it shaken to the foundations? I think I agree in that there is an entry point in the contemporary movement over Black Lives Matter that could direct the political aspirations of youth and not just youth, but of the past several generations in this country towards something that would be a fundamentally transformative, or at least potentially transformative force. But I think that what we lack today has to be acknowledged, which is that we lack both an actual inherited generational experience of a time when there was a constituted politics on an ongoing basis that could move from expression to expression and build a cumulative force in society. Be it the history of the Communist Party, or be it the history more globally of socialism, that isn't here today. And I applaud comrades for being part of an organization and working towards that. But I think when anyone is being honest with themselves, that there is a recognition that what we exist, any of the organizations represented here today, any of the other ones who could have been invited, really any left organization at all today, doesn't hold that kind of power to really develop from each individual expression into a society-changing movement. So I think it just opens the question of what is going to be necessary to do that, and so the kind of transition between where we are today and where we need to be at the eve of the revolution, I think, is the fundamental question that we face today. And while I agree that the problems that are posed are not going to be solved under capitalism, I think capitalism has a lot of leeway. It's kind of like a swaying skyscraper. It moves in order to not break, and that will continue. And that's not that structural quality of it is not going to go away. But I think that we have to think about what is going to be the transition between the relative helplessness and disempowerment that exists today to a moment in which the very structures of society are put on the table in the form of revolutionary development. And I don't think it just simply proceeds from Occupy or from Black Lives Matter. I wish that it was just a question of building brick upon brick upon brick. But I think that there's something more broken than that. And I don't have an answer to what that is. I think that's why Platypus was founded, or at least why I was helping to found it. Because I think that the fundamental task that we face today, which is not going to put food on the table, and I admit that, and it's not going to address all the problems that you guys are describing, which are real, but it nevertheless tasks us, is this question of what do we do in our circumstances, and how do we recognize them clearly for what they are? And we might dispute that, but that's exactly the point. It's exactly the fact that we would dispute it that points to the fact that question, it needs to be addressed. I hope to be on the barricades one day with my comrades here, and the terms of the conflict be that stark, but I don't think that they can be just at the outset. I think that has to be built through struggle and through movement, and through theory and through an analysis of our society. I think that there's no other way, and I think the people of the past kind of knew that more. I think that there was a sense that Lenin and Luxembourg in 1917, they didn't just show up on the scene when the soldiers were bold. There have been 40 years of socialism and building towards that in Europe, and I don't think that in the United States, I think that the civil rights movement is the prime example of how politics in this country don't just emerge out of nowhere. And we always remember the 1950s and 1960s, but it didn't start then by any measure. And so, there needs to be this sense of, what is the incremental steps that gets us from the present to our desired future where things are posed more clearly?
Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. So I'd like to offer our panelists just a moment to make some brief closing remarks. And I believe that some of us might be meeting afterwards, so you're welcome to stick around and talk more then. Eljeer.
Okay. Trotsky has this quote. I'm going to paraphrase it. When the winds of change are taking place, it brushes the top of the trees first. Occupy was that, in my mind. It was tops of the trees. It was a disaffected youth, middle class, many white, who saw the American dream becoming the American nightmare. That they now understood that their generation will be far worse off than their own parents and perhaps even their grandparents, in fact. Black Lives Matter, in my respect, and also Social Alternative, sees it as a continuum of a more larger process that's taking place internationally. If it's Syriza in Greece, if it's Podemos in Spain, if it's the struggle against water charges in Ireland, if it's the Arab Spring movement, or even Wisconsin, not this Wisconsin, but the Wisconsin of 2011, in fact, that it was the youth that started this whole process. So in some ways, we're seeing the wind pick up. And now it's not the top of the trees anymore. It's, in fact, a tree. And it's now getting into the roots of that tree and shaking the tree. And in many ways, the genie is out of the bottle. They can't put it back in. The question is will they realize historical memory? In Ghana, there's a thing called a Sankofa bird. Sankofa is always looking back to understand the past, to understand the present, to provide the way forward for the future. And so in many ways, we have to be, from my standpoint, our organization tries to be, not just talk about the defeats. Yes, that could be a little depressing. But we talk about the victories, too, and how those victories were won, how those struggles were won as a point of reference, because this generation doesn't have historical memory. That's not their fault, in fact. There were defeats that took place, vicious defeats, that we have to remind them of how it took place. And so I think of the low-wage workers, for example, because when we think about the fight for 15 or the $15 minimum wage struggle, most people say, what does that really matter? $15 is so low. We agree, actually, it's quite low. It should be, in fact, in the high 20s, maybe even 30s, in fact. Everyone should be in a union. But once again, we're starting from, in some ways, ground zero. And the low-wage workers are going to go on strike on April 15th. We got ourselves involved in that campaign. Why? Because we needed some victories. It's not going to bring down capitalism, the fight for 15. Certainly it will not. But it gives young people, and particularly low-wage workers, the sense that, as a collective, we can struggle and fight. That's the power of the Selma film. It has problems. But I'll tell you one thing. What it does do, it informs us to say that when people come together and struggle, that they can transform the world. They can move the world, in fact. I was in Ireland recently. The civil rights movement was instructive for those in the North, actually, who were going on the question of the divide between Protestant and Catholic. That's the power of internationalism. And so, in many ways, our role as a Marxist, as part of a revolutionary organization, as part of an international organization, we want to help to shape and build a movement. But also, we know that to defeat this monster, you need your own organizations. You need your own weapons. Because the ruling elite may squabble with each other on their own national interests, but they will come together the way they did in October 1917 to put down the Bolshevik Revolution. 21 nations, including the United States, sent troops to put down that revolution because they understood what that meant. The fight for 15 or any other reform, it's not about the reform per se. It's the whole idea about power. They want to make sure that you understand that you don't have power in this nation, in this world. And they will do everything they can to smash that. And so in many ways, we need to build our movement, but we need to build our own instruments of struggle, our own political party, our own organizations that has history and theory behind it. So if you're so inclined, check us out. We have our newspaper sitting right there, Black Lives Matter, beautiful painting on the front cover. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Can you add something just to his just a little bit? I'm a Greek. So as a active member of the Syriza radical left, I'm not an American citizen, so I'm just observing. I've been living here for the last 6 years as an international student, and I'm observing the political situation. And I think America needs like a revolution. It's obvious, and it's about time that it happens. And the problems keep adding up. Like, it's not just like racism, class inequality, like gender issues, the immigrants, like this, like, and the list goes on. What I think you mentioned, and I think it's very correct, is that, in my opinion, there's a need for an umbrella that feeds everybody in, instead of like separating those, hierarchizing these problems. That's what I wish to say.
So, I mean, I think a couple things. I mean, you talked about, well, look, let's be honest, the left is small. And that's obvious. Nobody would dispute that. But the question, part of the question, you know, it's like, is what's true and how do we actually move forward? And, you know, while I think it is you can learn something by looking at history, but I don't think you actually need to completely sum that up before people are going to move forward. And I think part of the thing is, you know, in 1848, Marx and Engels were comparatively small. They didn't say, well, damn, you know, we haven't had 40 years of struggle. Let's wait until Lenin comes along and we'll set the ground for that. They were like, let's try and make everything possible out of these revolutions. And they were running from Austria to Germany to England and trying to do everything possible, getting kicked out of, you know, countries and stuff. And so I think the thing is, we are where we are. You know, there have been actual, real, great, you know, socialist revolutions, both in the Soviet Union and China, which had some real shortcomings, which weren't going to get to Marx's vision of a world without classes. Which the question is that true? Is his analysis of capitalism correct? Can we actually get to a world without classes? Or do we have to put up with some variation of capitalism, be it what they have in England or France or America in the 1870s or America in the 2030s or whatever? You know, it's like, or can you get to a world where people can actually relate as sort of emancipators of humanity and freely associating human beings? I think that's actually possible and very desirable and necessary. And, you know, there's a lot of work to do to sum up, particularly past socialist societies. I don't think summing up the history of the American left is actually going to tell you a lot about sort of what to do now. Because, I mean, frankly, the big problem in the American left is it was too goddamn, you know, enthusiastic about America. I mean, you know, in the Communist Party in the 30s was, you know, instead of looking at the economic crisis and collapse and the depression and saying, look, we need to actually bury this system, they were like, how can we patch this up? How can we find the interests of the working class, particularly white working class? You know, and you know, and yes, there were, you know, Black Harry Hayward, you know, did some stuff as far as sort of is looking at the national question, but we don't actually need to get into all that. I mean, I understand some of it, but I'm an artist, and I'm actually not representing any organization. I'm very passionate about, you know, Bob Avakian and his writing and his films, but you know, I'm an artist, and I'd say, you know, if people want to check this stuff out, they should actually go to the source of people who have really gotten deeply into this. But on that basis, I say we need to move. And I have no illusions that the spontaneity of Black Lives Matter is actually going to lead to a revolution. That revolutions are not spontaneous events. But if we don't recognize that what is coming up, the ruptures that have happened, the disaffection that people have, and fight like everything to re-seize the initiative, get out in the streets, struggle with people, including in this school, at this moment, at this time. You all need to participate as much as possible, as much as you can, in April 14th. You need to actually do as much as possible to shut this school down as part of actually building a movement to end police brutality. And for those of you who want to see that go further to revolution, get into the revolution. You know? So yeah, I'll leave it on that.
Now I'm stuck with the uncomfortable position of having to like be the down note on the end of everything, which is, you know, why I'm tasked by Platypus to be on the panel in some ways. But I mean, to just respond to your Trotsky quote about the tops of trees, I mean, I would use another quote from Trotsky to perhaps disenchant us a little bit from any excessive enthusiasm in the moment about our moment. You know, Trotsky wrote that, again to paraphrase, that if the Fourth International was unable to make inroads and lead the revolution with the working class and black Americans, that the permanent revolution and all the rest was a lie. Right? And frankly, that's kind of what happened. That's kind of what happened. Right? I mean, it didn't work out. Like, communism didn't succeed in its century in a way. I mean, the 20th century is the century of communism. And the 21st century is unfortunately the century of, that becoming a distant memory. I mean, even in China. So, I mean, and of course, it's a complicated thing. And, I don't want to say that anything is any one thing, because it's a world of contradiction. That's the whole point of Marxism, is to recognize a world of contradiction and to understand how that contradiction leads to possibilities for emancipatory developments, but also restrains those same possibilities. I think that we do live in a moment that demands something new politically on the scene, and be it an umbrella organization, which if that was existing, I would probably be very much involved. But I also feel like it's not sufficient in this country, and that this country also needs to address the fact that for the past 30 years, we've all just gone to the protest, chanted the chants, and didn't recognize how much difference we may have in our attitudes and our opinions and our politics. And I think that these things have to go hand in hand. I think that criticism within the movement, criticism within Marxism, criticism of socialism, on the grounds of socialism itself, is the only way forward for the socialist movement. And I hope that that something comes into play that shows all the pessimism that I may be accused of to have been dead wrong. I truly do hope that that's the case. But I also think that in the meantime, I'm going to be a ruthless critic of everything existing. I mean, that's the lesson from Marx that I think is most important for our world today. We have to be the ruthless critics of everything existing. That means us and our inherited ideas, our inherited politics. And that criticism is not meant to be negating of our possibility, but rather it's way forward. And so, I'll leave it with that. I mean, for a ruthless critique of everything existing. That's what we have to stand behind.
Thank you to our panelists and to the Black Student Union.